10 members of the Security Council.
Gabe, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that UN Security Council session has begun. Let's listen in.
With Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2024/239, the text of the draft resolution submitted by the United States of America. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements before the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, for all the stories that have been written about divisions in this Council, and there are many real divisions, I believe most of us share many of the same goals. First and foremost, we want to see an immediate and sustained ceasefire as part of a deal that leads to the release of all hostages being held by Hamas and other groups, and that will allow much more life-saving humanitarian aid to get into Gaza. Of course, we can't just want that to happen. We have to make that happen. We have to do the hard work of diplomacy. I know you've heard me say that a lot, and that's because it's the truth. A Security Council resolution means much less if it is not actually made real on the ground. That's why the United States, Egypt, and Qatar are working around the clock in the region to secure an immediate and sustained ceasefire as part of a deal that leads to the release of all hostages being held by Hamas and other groups that will help us address the dire humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We believe we're close. We're not there yet, unfortunately. And this moment is one where the Security Council has a critical role to play. By adopting the resolution before us, we can put pressure on Hamas to accept the deal on the table. Colleagues, you don't need me to tell you that every day without a deal, meaning every day without a ceasefire, leads to more needless suffering. For more than 100 hostages, including a 1-year-old child being held in captivity by Hamas and other groups, for innocent Palestinians in Gaza who have been displaced, who are starving, who desperately need peace. For Israelis who've continued to face missile attacks from Hamas, a terrorist group that set this conflict into motion on October 7th. Every day without a deal means more needless suffering. This resolution will move us closer to securing that deal and help us alleviate that suffering. And I urge all Council members to vote yes, to vote for a resolution that at long last condemns Hamas for its horrific terrorist attacks and sexual violence, that makes clear that all civilians, Palestinians and Israelis, should be able to live without fear of violence, that demands the protection of civilians in Gaza, and stresses that a major ground offensive in Rafah poses a grave threat to civilians, even as we still work toward eliminating Hamas from all parts of Gaza. That calls on Israel to eliminate all barriers and restrictions to humanitarian aid, especially as the threat of famine looms large in northern Gaza. That condemns calls to resettle Gaza and makes clear that the Palestinian Authority should have ultimate authority over Gaza, and that reiterates this Council's support for a two-state solution. This is a strong resolution. It's the byproduct of exhaustive, inclusive negotiations. It reflects the consensus of this council. And it does more than just call for a ceasefire. It helps to make a ceasefire possible. It would be a historic mistake for the council to not adopt this text. And I again urge all council members to vote yes. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, the United Nations Security Council has, for half a year, 6 months, been unable to adopt a document with a demand for a ceasefire in Gaza. All of the attempts, time and again, came up against the resistance of the United States, who 4 times, in cold blood, cast a veto in this chamber. In this time, we have heard from U.S. colleagues repeatedly their justifications. Either they were saying that the achievement of a ceasefire is premature, insofar as there is a need to give space for so-called counterterrorism efforts of Israel, or they demanded for the Security Council not to stand in the way of effective diplomacy of Washington on the ground. That is a quote. Or they called for us to wait for the onset of Ramadan, when apparently an agreement would definitely be reached for a ceasefire, for an end to the violence. And now, 6 months have elapsed. Gaza has virtually been wiped from the earth, and now the U.S. representative, without blinking, has been asserting that Washington has finally begun to recognize the need for a ceasefire. This sluggish thought process in Washington has come at the cost of the lives of 32,000 peaceful Palestinians, 2/3 of whom are women and children. And even now we have observed a typical hypocritical spectacle when, wrapped up in a ceasefire, the United States have been trying to sell a product to the membership of the Security Council and to the entire international community. They've been trying to sell something completely different, namely a diluted formulation about a definition and determination of the imperative for a ceasefire. This kind of philosophical passages about moral imperatives are seen in limited quantities in the work of Immanuel Kant. However, to save the lives of peaceful Palestinian civilians, this is not enough. And this is in no way what is stipulated in the mandate of the UN Security Council, the council which is vested with a unique mechanism to demand a ceasefire and, where necessary, to compel compliance therewith. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, during an official interview in Jeddah on the 20th of March with the correspondent Al-Haddad, stated, and I quote, "Well, in fact, we actually have a resolution that we put forward right now that's before the UN Security Council that does call for an immediate ceasefire tied to the release of hostages, and we hope very much that countries will support that." End quote. However, in the text of the U.S. draft, which has been put to the vote today, there is no such call. So what turns out is that either the U.S. representative at the United Nations or the U.S. Secretary of State have been deliberately misleading the international community. Distinguished colleagues, from the very onset, it was clear that the so-called negotiations which our U.S. colleagues have been engaged in on this issue have been focused merely to drag out the time. All of our comments, all of our red lines were time and time disregarded, as were the proposals of a number of other delegations. This was some kind of an empty rhetorical exercise rather than normal work on a document. The American product is exceedingly politicized, the sole purpose of which is to help to play to the voters, to throw them a bone in the form of some kind of a mention of a ceasefire in Gaza, and to establish the U.S.'s political ambitions in the region through the establishment of terrorist labels, and to ensure the impunity of Israel, whose crimes in the draft are not even assessed. I wish to draw attention to the following. The U.S. draft contains an effective green light for Israel to mount a military operation in Rafah. At the very least, the authors try to make it such that nothing would prevent Western Jerusalem from continuing their brutal cleansing of the south of the Gaza Strip. And what is Washington actually trying to achieve? We have already stated that we will no longer tolerate pointless resolutions which do not contain a call for a ceasefire, which lead us to nowhere. This draft should not pass with the majority of the membership to send a message about the inadmissibility, not the palliative, but the actual intentions of Washington. It would be very strange for us to see those members of the Council, of whom there are a majority, who understand this and who persuaded us of the deficiencies in the U.S. draft. We'd be surprised if they now lift their hands voting in favor of it. Ladies and gentlemen, if you do this, you will cover yourselves in disgrace. Consider once again, how will you look before the population of the Middle East, in front of your own populations, if you support this hypocritical initiative, which is designed to disorient the international community and essentially to undermine the authority of the Council, making sure that it cannot have an impact on the situation on the ground, that this Council will not be able to have an impact of the situation on the ground, to ensure that it not get in the way of the White House? Are you willing to play into their hands when it comes to this unsavory spectacle? The Russian Federation will not do this. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, as one of the founders of the United Nations, we recognize the historical global responsibility we shoulder for the maintenance of international peace and security. We cannot allow the Security Council to become an instrument in the advancement of Washington's destructive policy in the Middle East. If this resolution is to be adopted, this would definitively close the door when it comes to discussions about the need for a ceasefire in Gaza. This would free the hands of Israel, and it would result in all of Gaza, its entire population, having to face destruction, devastation, or expulsion. We are not guided by what is convenient for Washington and satellites, the satellites who raise their hands following instructions from Washington. We do not follow this. What guides us is what is necessary for the Palestinian people and what helps to advance peace. We call upon the membership of the Security Council not to allow this to occur, to vote against the U.S. draft. Mr. President, for the United Nations Security Council to ultimately be in a position to deliver upon its mandate for the maintenance of international peace and security, a number of non-permanent members of the Security Council have drafted an alternative draft resolution which stipulates black on white the demand for both a ceasefire and the unconditional release of hostages. This is a balanced and an apolitical document. We see no reason for which the membership of the Security Council, for the members of the Security Council not to support this, unless a ceasefire and the release of hostages is not part of their plans. This is an attempt to allow the Council to comply with the noble functions that have been vested in it, and I call for you not to let this opportunity slip away. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for their statement. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/239 please raise their hand? Those against? Abstention. The result of the voting is as follows: 11 votes in favor, 3 votes against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you again, Mr. President. Colleagues, today,
Okay, so we have been watching there the UN Security Council voting on the latest draft resolution by the United States, which spoke of the imperative need for a ceasefire, which has been vetoed by Russia, which means that it is not going to go through. Let's listen to the US Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who's speaking now.
veto. And now, Russia and China will give you all sorts of explanations for its obstruction. But whether or not it will admit it, there are 2 deeply, deeply cynical reasons behind its votes. First, Russia and China still could not bring itself to condemn Hamas's terrorist attacks on October 7th. Can we just pause on that for a moment? Russia and China refuses to condemn Hamas for burning people alive, for gunning down innocent civilians at a concert, for raping women and girls, for taking hundreds of people hostage. This was the deadliest single attack on Jews since the Holocaust. And a permanent member of this council can't even condemn it. I'm sorry, it's really outrageous, and it's below the dignity of this body. The second reason behind this veto is not just cynical, it's also petty. Russia and China simply did not want to vote for a resolution that was penned by the United States because it would rather see us fail than to see this council succeed. Even after inclusive consultations over weeks and weeks, even after negotiations and edits produced a draft that received overwhelming council support. And as you saw today, nearly every council member voted to put the full weight of this body behind the diplomatic efforts to secure an immediate and sustained ceasefire as part of a deal that leads to the release of all hostages that will allow much more humanitarian aid to get into Gaza. But once again, Russia put politics over progress. Russia, who has carried out an unprovoked war on its neighbor, has the audacity and the hypocrisy to throw stones when it lives in a glass house itself. So let's be honest, for all the fiery rhetoric, we all know that Russia and China are not doing anything diplomatically to advance a lasting peace or to meaningfully contribute to the humanitarian response effort. Colleagues, there is obviously another resolution that some of you would like to be considered, but in its current form, that text fails to support sensitive diplomacy in the region. Worse, it could actually give Hamas an excuse to walk away from the deal on the table. All of us want to see this council speak out, but we should not move forward with any resolution that jeopardizes the ongoing negotiations. And these are not just negotiations that are being carried out by the United States. Others in the region, Qatar and Egypt, are engaged on these negotiations. So if that alternative resolution comes up for a vote and does not support the diplomacy happening on the ground, we may once again find this council deadlocked. I truly hope that that does not come about. And so for our part, the United States will keep at it. We'll continue to work toward a deal alongside Qatar and Egypt. And we will work with any council member that is seriously interested in adopting a resolution that will help make that deal possible. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement.